I was halfway through my morning coffee when the Slack ping hit. Trent Mallory had removed my admin access to the compliance sync server. Just like that. No warning, no message, no explanation. The same server that funneled every legally mandated log and audit trail Leybourne Capital needed to stay above board. I stared at the screen, half expecting it to be a mistake, but it wasn't. That little red access denied banner was the digital equivalent of a middle finger. I didn't slam the mug down, didn't storm into an office. I just blinked, stood up, and quietly walked to the file cabinet where I kept the original vendor agreement. A hard copy, signed and stamped. You don't build systems for billion-dollar compliance portfolios without keeping your own receipts. By the way, real quick, if you're listening in and haven't subscribed yet, hit that button and like the video. Seriously, 97% of you ghost watch these stories, and it means the world to the team when you support what we do. All right, back to Trent's genius idea to pick a fight with the infrastructure. Here's what no one in that slick glass conference room ever realized. I wasn't Leybourne's internal tech girl. I was the principal architect of our external vendor environment, licensed and billed through my own consulting firm, ValenceNet. The shared drives, the compliance pipelines, the automation scripts that made everyone else's job easier. Those weren't company resources. They were mine, provisioned, monitored, and maintained under contract. You'd think someone with Trent's shiny title might have read a single clause before yanking cords. But no. He just walked in, all swagger and buzzwords, shouting about cutting middlemen and owning our stack. He called a meeting on his second week, stood at the front like some TED Talk dropout, and declared we'd be phasing out third-party dependencies. He meant me. He just didn't know it yet. He waved around some cost optimization chart like it was gospel, circling a red bubble labeled vendor redundancies. One of those bubbles was ValenceNet. I watched him grin at the CFO and say, "We'll save 7 figures in 6 months." I didn't flinch. Not then. I just looked at the timestamp on the slide deck and saved a screenshot for later. That deck would end up costing them $4.9 million. Over the next few weeks, he got bolder. Started revoking licenses, resetting admin roles, running audits I wasn't even copied on. He had some junior dev from finance rewrite permissions for folders they didn't even understand. They broke the metadata sync twice, pulled one of the SOC2 queues offline for 3 days without even realizing it. Still, I didn't raise my voice. I just made a note. The moment they touched the shared drive environment, it would trigger breach clauses. I didn't need revenge. I had a contract. And contracts, unlike egos, don't bluff. The best part? That shared drive wasn't even a drive. It was a virtualized vendor environment, fully managed, cloud-native, and isolated from internal infrastructure. I designed it that way to reduce insider risk. The access was federated, the logs were immutable, and the encryption keys, well, those were rotated through my firm's secure policy under our licensing agreement. Meaning, no one at Leybourne could even look at the underlying services without pinging ValenceNet for credentials. Credentials I didn't give out. By the time Trent figured out something wasn't adding up, the system had already logged 147 denied access attempts from internal IPs. He thought he was disabling a Google Drive. What he really did was sever the compliance backbone of a $9.2 billion asset firm without legal consultation. And still, I waited, didn't gloat. Didn't warn. I let the wheel spin, let him collect his little wins, let him strut around like he was building something. Because every puffed-up decision he made was just walking the company closer to a very expensive wall. And I'd already paved the impact site in boilerplate, clause-wrapped concrete. I wasn't some file-pushing middle manager. I was the vendor. And Trent? Trent had no idea he'd just started a countdown. The memo went out the first Monday after New Year's. Subject line, Q1 Strategic Savings Roadmap. Full of vague jargon and generic clip art, like someone let ChatGPT make a PowerPoint. Buried on slide 6, under low-hanging efficiencies, was a bullet point that said, Decommission third-party shared environment. Ops, 38K Q savings. That was me. Not mentioned by name, of course. Just reduced to a budget line and a parenthetical brag. The next day, I watched Trent run his little show from the corner of the war room. A click here, a script there. He used a cloud console like it was a toy. Half the staff had no idea what he was even doing, just nodding along, sipping their cold brews while Trent rambled about tightening the pipeline and regaining operational ownership. The dev from marketing whispered, "Is that safe?" And Trent winked. "We're not cutting anything we can't rebuild." That's what he said. I nearly laughed. Rebuild? He couldn't rebuild a sandwich without a tutorial. Then came the real mistake. He revoked 6 user groups tied to external authentication. Said we had too many phantom accounts leaching data. One of them? My firm's vendor access credentials. Another? The automation relay for the compliance tracebacks we were obligated to maintain under regulatory review. When I flagged it, he sent a Slack reply with a single sentence. "We don't need middlemen." No signature, no emoji, just digital arrogance pretending to be leadership. Thing is, Trent thought he was slashing fat. What he didn't realize was that he was cutting into bone. My environment wasn't some Dropbox workaround. It was a fully compartmentalized, zero-trust vendor space designed to reduce internal failure points, streamline audit readiness, and separate operations from governance. Every process he thought he was bringing in-house was already outsourced legally and contractually through me. And not because I wanted to play gatekeeper, but because no one else at Laybourne ever wanted to own those systems. They just wanted them to work. I'd built that environment slowly over years with surgical contracts and ironclad renewal clauses. The shared workspace wasn't even hosted on Laybourne's infrastructure. It sat on a cloud tenancy registered under ValenceNet LLC, which meant when he reset permissions, all he really did was lock Laybourne out of its own regulated pipeline, like changing the locks on a house you rent without telling the landlord. Spoiler? The landlord always finds out. Usually with a bill. But I didn't protest. I didn't explain. I just logged out of my console that afternoon and waited, quietly, patiently, because Clause 4.3 of the vendor contract stated that any interference with ValenceNet's operating environment without 30-day written notice would trigger a default escalation process, with penalties. The legalese was thick, but the outcome was clear. Trent had broken a binding agreement. He didn't know any of that, of course. He was too busy doing victory laps in the Friday sync meeting, pointing at charts that showed an access cost reduction and bragging about cleaning up legacy junk. The founder's old executive assistant, who had been around long before either of us, leaned over and murmured, "He's touching things he doesn't understand." I smiled politely, didn't say a word, but I noted the timestamp. 1 week from that meeting, the first warning ping would go out. External audit systems would miss their sync. Compliance reports would fail checksum. And Trent would realize he hadn't removed a middleman. He'd exiled the only person holding the keys to the kingdom. I wasn't being vindictive. I was just tired of being mistaken for overhead. Let them find out what redundant really means when their entire regulatory compliance framework flatlines at the end of the quarter. Laybourne didn't need middlemen? Fine. But the middleman they just deleted was the only one who ever read the contract. It came without ceremony, without tact, without the decency of a face-to-face conversation. Just a Slack ping at 9:42 a.m., timestamped like a bad joke. Send over the drive password. You're done here. Desk cleared by noon. No punctuation, no context. Just the digital equivalent of being shoved into traffic while someone yells about synergy. It didn't come from HR. It didn't come with an exit packet. It came directly from Trent Mallory, Vice President of Operations, crusader against bloat, keyboard commando, and apparently now acting head of firing people via Slack. I stared at the message for a long second. Not because I was shocked. I wasn't. I'd seen this coming. But because I knew what was about to happen, and part of me was almost impressed by the sheer stupidity of it. He hadn't even tried to pretend this was above board. No HR liaison, no legal notice, just one smug sentence tossed through the system like a grenade, so I typed back. One line. No anger, no elaboration. Just the truth wrapped in velvet legal steel. There is no password. That drive is a vendor-managed environment, licensed under ValenceNet. And then I logged out. I didn't wait for a reply. I didn't send follow-ups. I just stood, walked to the break room, poured myself the last half-inch of burnt coffee from the pot Trent always complained about but never refilled, and took my time stirring in a sugar packet that expired in 2021. By the time I returned to my desk, my internal email had been disabled. Just a gray box where my inbox used to be, as if my existence had been wiped with a keystroke. The irony was rich. He'd cut me out of the one system I never needed access to in the first place. I was the system. 10 minutes later, I got a call. Not from Trent, not from HR, but from someone in legal, whispering like they were in a confessional booth. "Did you just get fired?" I could hear the panic in her voice. I said nothing for a beat. Then, apparently. She exhaled like she'd just learned the building was on fire and no one pulled the alarm. "Please tell me you didn't give him access to the drive." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The silence said more than words could. A beat later, she muttered, "Oh, God," and hung up. Because here's what Trent had just done, live on Slack with zero legal review. He'd terminated the sole point of contact to a critical vendor-managed compliance environment that hosted every audit log, every SOC2 trigger, every regulatory checkpoint that kept Leybourne Capital from being turned inside out by the feds. And worse, he'd issued a written demand for access, one that directly violated Clause 6.2 of the vendor agreement, which clearly stated that no access shall be transferred without dual-party agreement in writing, notarized, and logged. He didn't just burn the bridge, he demolished it, then emailed the wreckage to legal with his name stamped on every beam. Within half an hour, his Slack message had been forwarded, not just to legal, but directly to the CEO's office. The same CEO who, while new, had been around long enough to know what a regulatory breach looked like and what it cost. Trent's email signature was now attached to a digital paper trail that screamed, "I have no idea how vendor contracts work. I am firing someone whose name is literally on the licensing agreement. I am demanding root access to an environment I do not own. They didn't even need an audit to figure it out. It was all in writing, all time-stamped, all clean." It wasn't sabotage, it was self-inflicted. And me? I sat there in my little cube, sipping expired coffee, watching the panic ripple outward. I didn't touch a thing, didn't pack my desk, didn't respond to follow-ups. I just waited, because Trent had declared a war he didn't understand. And the first shot he fired straight into a contract, the kind with teeth. The problem wasn't that Trent made a mistake. It's that he made the wrong kind of mistake, the kind that gets printed, signed, countersigned, filed with legal, and entered into a court record. He thought he was canceling a shared drive. What he actually did was terminate a vendor-managed compliance environment with a binding SLA tied to federal oversight. And he did it with one Slack message and zero paperwork. Here's what that shared drive really was: a backbone. It hosted 7 years of metadata audits, time-stamped for integrity. It ran the SOC2 compliance scheduler, which batched encryption cert verifications every Tuesday before sunrise. It pushed reporting queues to our SEC portal with a 48-hour grace window per the Sarbanes-Oxley integration clause. It maintained chain of custody logs for every financial model that moved from the dev sandbox to live production. In other words, it wasn't a drive, it was a living compliance nerve center, licensed, operated, and owned by ValenceNet LLC, my LLC, and that licensing agreement. It wasn't some cobbled-together DocuSign template. It was a 24-page negotiated contract, signed by our then CFO and reviewed by Leybourne's outside counsel. Section 4.2a. Vendor services must not be materially disrupted or terminated without a 30-day collaborative renegotiation window. Section 6.2. Early termination without cause will result in a flat penalty of $4.9 million, payable within 14 calendar days. Section 8.1c. Credentialed access remains the property of the vendor and cannot be reassigned or mirrored without written permission from both parties. It was all right there, all spelled out. And Trent never read a word of it. Why would he? He thought I was an internal tech girl with a fancy title and some overcomplicated backup system. He never once asked what ValenceNet actually did, never noticed the quarterly vendor invoices that ran through procurement like clockwork. I'd built the whole system quietly, efficiently, and with surgical legal clarity. Not because I wanted power, but because I knew eventually someone like Trent would show up and try to cut corners with a machete. The real irony? I was invited to build it this way. Back when Laybourne was bleeding hours trying to track audit logs across 6 siloed platforms, I proposed the vendor route. I registered ValenceNet, filed the paperwork, and made myself their primary compliance services provider. I did the work no one wanted to think about. And because I did it quietly, effectively, and without demanding a seat at anyone's stupid ego table, they forgot who held the pen. Until Trent tried to snatch the pen out of my hand and found out it was dipped in ink that bites back. The moment he sent that Slack message, he triggered breach. There was no gray area, no let's talk it through zone, just a contractually binding violation with a price tag and a timeline. Legal saw it within minutes. The general counsel's assistant called me directly, nervous, shaky voice asking if I'd really been let go. I told her I couldn't comment on employment matters, but that my firm had just lost a client under breach. She went quiet for a long time, then whispered, "He didn't know, did he?" No, he didn't. Because to Trent, power came from the org chart, from being able to fire someone with a sentence. But I never needed their org chart. I had a signature, his predecessor's on page 17, and that held more weight than any title Trent could flex in a Slack channel. And the best part? I didn't even have to raise my voice. The contract did all the shouting for me. The first red flag didn't wave. It screamed. At 10:15 a.m., barely half an hour after Trent's Slack bullet to my head, the first alert chirped from a monitoring terminal in the finance wing. I wasn't there, obviously. I'd already been locked out of the internal network. But people talk. And when the SEC artifact sync failed checksum validation 3 times in a row, someone in audit muttered, "Is the server down?" No, the server wasn't down. It was just refusing to recognize them, because I'd never given them keys. And Trent had just thrown out the locksmith. By 10:22 a.m., the weekly retention protocol for financial statements failed its run. Then the internal compliance calendar bot went silent. It was supposed to generate reminders, upload checklists, archive metadata logs. Instead, it returned a polite but damning error message. Access denied. Credential mismatch. Please contact ValenceNet. And just like that, the system started eating itself alive. One failed script at a time. Trent's little optimization posse, 2 consultants with matching buzz cuts and laptop stickers that said things like, "Kill the middle layer," tried to reroute access using their admin credentials. Good luck. They weren't even registered in the token rotation. The moment they attempted a back-end handshake, the firewall logs lit up with entries tagged "Unauthorized Override Attempt." Next to each attempt was a phrase burned into every audit log by design. ValenceNet proprietary license, breach protection active. Every subsystem they tried to salvage was locked into service accounts I had embedded over 4 years, carefully, methodically, with redundancy fails and tamper alerts tied to external watchdogs. Because nobody ever asked me to remove them. Nobody ever said, "We've got it from here." They just assumed I'd always be there, quiet, invisible, supporting everything from the shadows until the day they hit delete on the wrong name and expected the lights to stay on. The legal department pulled the full trace logs by mid-morning. From what I heard, the general counsel personally printed 3 pages from the system monitor and walked them straight into the CEO's office. On each page, a recurring error stamp, SEC tool, upload path invalid, vendor key missing, and just beneath that, escalation path disabled per section. 6.2, early termination. That was clause language, not tech speak. Legal knew exactly what it meant. The breach was real, active, and expensive. It tried to patch around it, resetting permissions, cloning access roles, even spinning up shadow environments. None of it worked. Every thread led back to my service credentials, which were tied to a license they no longer had legal access to. You can't forge a handshake when the keys are cryptographically signed to a revoked vendor. The whole ecosystem was locked down by design. Because if you're going to manage sensitive regulatory frameworks for a $9 billion asset firm, you don't build systems on trust. You build them on proof. I had engineered every failsafe, every credential rotation, every redundancy layer, and I hadn't done it for power. I'd done it because I was the one they'd trusted not to let things fall apart. And now they had. Not because I sabotaged anything, but because Trent assumed that removing a person meant removing their presence. He never understood the difference between access and ownership. So while dashboards blinked red and meetings got canceled and consultants argued with scripts they couldn't decipher, I sat at home, watching my inbox fill with automated alerts from the vendor system, every one of them time-stamped, archived, and labeled unauthorized interaction. No one ever thought to ask what would happen if the quiet vendor in the background disappeared. Now they were finding out. Not in a bang, but in the slow, suffocating silence of automation that no longer recognized its creators. They say systems fail slowly, then all at once. At Laybourne, the collapse started with a missing spreadsheet. The quarterly CFO call was supposed to be at noon. These weren't just routine check-ins. They were scheduled, rehearsed, and choreographed to the second. Deck finalized 2 days in advance. Financials reviewed by legal the night before, call sheets printed, water bottles labeled. By 11 hours a.m., the war room should have been humming with last-minute prep. Instead, it was silent. The screens were blank. The links wouldn't load. What triggered the panic wasn't the absence of data, it was the absence of access. The artifact links embedded in the deck, the ones pointing to compliance-approved versions of Q4 reconciliation sheets, deferred revenue breakdowns, and Treasury audit trail summaries, were all returning 403 errors. Forbidden. Not file not found. Not missing. Forbidden. The system was still there. It just didn't recognize them. At 11:07, someone from internal audit pinged IT with a ticket flagged critical CFO call blockage. A junior sysadmin replied 4 minutes later with a sentence that should have sent chills down every executive spine. We have no visibility into the vendor space. That was the moment it all cracked open. Legal, already on edge after Trent's early morning improvisation, yanked the vendor agreement from their digital archive and walked it, physically, into the executive suite. No summaries, no memos, just the document itself, with one clause highlighted in yellow and underlined with someone's shaking hand. Access to ValenceNet managed environments, including reporting infrastructure and compliance logs, rests solely with the vendor of record. Any unapproved administrative action may constitute breach under Section 6.2. They didn't need to interpret it. It was plain English. Laybourne had built their quarterly reporting flow on an infrastructure they didn't own, that they never mirrored, that they never documented internally, because I had handled all of it, by their request, under contract. And now they had no access, because they had no vendor, because Trent had fired me, without negotiation, without legal review, without the 30-day window required by the very agreement they'd signed. At 11:12 a.m., the CFO call was officially canceled. They didn't blame Trent. Not yet. They blamed technical instability, said it was a temporary permissions issue. But everyone in that suite already knew the truth. The air was thick with it. They'd pulled a thread they didn't understand, and the whole system was unraveling in real time. That's when the CEO, quiet until that moment, turned to legal and asked, "Who owns ValenceNet?" Not, "What is it?" Not, "Who runs it?" Who owns it? And someone, probably the assistant general counsel who'd been there longer than most, answered without looking up. "She does." I wasn't just the contractor. I was the sole proprietor. Every line of the service agreement, every credential, every license renewal, tied to my name, my EIN, my firm. Not just a cog in their machine. The machine they built their workflows on. The one Trent tried to replace without knowing what powered it. The boardroom went quiet. They didn't scramble. Not yet. That came later. For now, they just sat with the realization the infrastructure they depended on had never truly belonged to them, and the one person who could bring it back online had already been erased from their systems by a VP who thought contracts were optional and infrastructure came with a reset button. It didn't. And Laybourne Capital was about to learn what happens when you treat a vendor like an employee, then fire her like dead weight. The email came in at 3:36 p.m. Subject line, "Re-contractual clarification, ValenceNet. No panic. No blame, just polite corporate phrasing stretched over pure desperation. It was from the general counsel herself. She opened with a soft acknowledgement of recent events, then eased into her ask like she was stepping onto a frozen pond. Would you be open to consulting on a temporary reconfiguration of systems previously managed by your firm? Consulting. Temporary. Reconfiguration. They still couldn't bring themselves to say undo. It was carefully worded, likely proofed by 3 other attorneys before it hit send. But underneath the pleasantries was one unmistakable truth. They'd miscalculated, and now the floor was giving out beneath them. I didn't reply. My lawyer did. His response was shorter than theirs, but infinitely sharper. He attached the original vendor agreement, highlighted and bookmarked for ease of reference. Section 6.2a, early vendor termination without cause, initiated unilaterally by the client, will trigger a non-negotiable early termination fee of $4.9 million, payable upon breach confirmation. He included a timeline of events: the Slack message, the immediate access removal, the attempted rerouting, the failed CFO call. All documented, all time-stamped. All damning. At the bottom of the email, he included an invoice. No fluff, no inflated charges, just the agreed-upon number. Subject line: formal notice of breach, early vendor termination. And just like that, all the swagger drained out of the building. I didn't hear from Trent again. He was suspended the next morning, pending internal review, according to the memo HR distributed, though the real review had already been written in error logs and legal clauses. His Slack account was deactivated quietly. No goodbye, no all-hands announcement. He just disappeared like a system process killed mid-execution. And no one asked where he went. Later that day, I received another message. This one wasn't from legal. It was from the CEO. It didn't come with any NDA, no strings, just a brief, privately sent note. He acknowledged what had happened, admitted that protocol had not been followed. That termination was mishandled, that internal dependencies had been misunderstood. He said he regretted how it unfolded. He said he valued what I'd built. I didn't respond. My counsel did. We sent a 2-line acknowledgement, confirmed receipt, noted that the apology was appreciated and recorded. Nothing more. Because an apology might feel good in the room, but it doesn't restore a system. It doesn't reset breach penalties. And it doesn't untrigger the legal protections I'd spent years building into every clause, every credential, every signed page. They didn't just sever a vendor. They severed the foundation under a $9.2 billion operational architecture. And it took them one Slack message to do it. They weren't asking for me back because they missed me. They were asking because, without ValenceNet, Laybourne Capital couldn't legally report its own numbers. I didn't need to raise my voice or return triumphant. All I had to do was let the contract speak, and it did, with perfect clarity. The board met behind closed doors the following Thursday. No press, no internal observers, no LinkedIn photo op of executives smiling with branded coffee mugs. Just a handful of decision makers in an oak-paneled room with a contract they never expected to reread this closely. By then, the panic had passed, but the silence was worse. Systems were back online, yes, temporarily, re-enabled by manual override through cached credentials and some quiet assistance I authorized through counsel. Strictly limited, strictly billed. Enough to keep the lights flickering, but not enough to claim operational control. They were limping, legally exposed, and one audit cycle away from a very public implosion. So the board did what boards do when the lawyers stop sugarcoating things. They voted. ValenceNet was reinstated under what they called an emergency operations continuity contract, the kind of language designed to hide the burn marks under a fresh coat of paint. But this time, it wasn't just a renewal. It came with a footnote: irrevocable status unless terminated by dual authorization, legal and the board. No more VPs going rogue. No more Slack messages as policy. If they wanted to remove me again, it would require signatures, deliberations, and accountability. Trent's name? Nowhere in the meeting minutes, no statement of gratitude, no attempt to soften the fallout. His suspension quietly transitioned into something more permanent. Outside of current planning scope, the HR note said. That was corporate for don't ask. And me? I didn't attend the meeting. Didn't zoom in, didn't demand a seat. I already had what I wanted: systemic acknowledgement, permanent structure, and a clause so deeply rooted in their governance that no one could pretend I wasn't essential anymore, not even the people who wanted to erase me. At 4:13 p.m., the shared drive came back online. No data lost, no corruption, no rollback needed, every sync reconnected, every audit trail resumed, because I never deleted a thing, never sabotaged, never touched a single byte. I just waited. That was always the plan. Quiet systems don't scream when they're ignored. They simply stop recognizing you. And now, every time someone opened a compliance folder or pulled a report or ran a weekly automation task, they were met with a new footer, added automatically by ValenceNet's license update script. Access provided under Continuity Clause 8.2. Termination requires dual approval. No fanfare, no revenge, just an asterisk that would live in their infrastructure forever. A reminder, not of what they lost, but of who they never bothered to understand, until it cost them everything. Every Monday at 3 a.m. sharp, the same thing happens. A silent handshake somewhere deep in the guts of Laybourne's compliance stack. The system spins up its scheduled task, line 7.14 of the regulatory readiness queue, checking time-stamped integrity logs, rotating encryption keys, verifying off-site backups. Then it sends a ping. Destination: ValenceNet. No one watches it. No one needs to. It was built to operate without applause, and every time, without fail, the system logs a single line in the compliance ledger: handshake complete. That's it. Not a line of code out of place, not a missing packet, just an uninterrupted signal between two endpoints that never stopped recognizing each other, even when one side tried to pretend the other didn't matter. They never told me if they fixed Trent's mess with a full debrief or just buried it under process improvements. Doesn't matter. His name never resurfaced. His optimization roadmap was quietly dissolved. The cost optimization firm was replaced within the quarter. New workflows were passed through legal before implementation now. And every executive onboarding packet includes a copy of the vendor relationship index. ValenceNet sits at the top, marked irrevocable. I still don't show up on the org chart. My badge was never reactivated. They didn't offer a seat at the table. But the table checks with me before every meeting, whether they know it or not. When the system pings at 3 a.m., it doesn't care who the VP is or what titles were shuffled around that week, or how many middlemen they promised to cut out in the latest all hands. It just wants proof that the pipeline works, that the logs are intact, that the chain of custody is still clean, and it still comes to me for that answer. The handshake isn't just protocol. It's memory, machine deep, contractual, precise. It doesn't forget who built it, doesn't forget the clause, doesn't forget what silence really means. I never asked to be celebrated, never wanted to be the hero. I just wanted the work to stand on its own, unshakable, untouched, undeniable. Now, every system at Laybourne keeps time by a quiet vendor they tried to erase, and every Monday morning, long before the building wakes, I watch the logs roll in. Oro 3, Oro 1, handshake complete, still here, still mine.